sustainable in the long term?
I think we'd like let you have a small talk about it, and then we can probably take questions from the audience. So Smita, if you go first.
I think I've already said what do I
Yeah, I think, yeah, there's no doubt that scale is important, but I think it's really important to focus on how meaningful the scaling is, and that, the enterprise has really thought about the consequences of scaling. So I think, yeah, so no doubt that scaling is important, but need to do it carefully and need to do it in a way that it really impacts communities the right way.
So what were the issues that you faced while trying to scale Rangoli?
We are still trying to scale, so we have not yet reached the point that we want to reach. But then, yeah, so as a social enterprise, I think the initial few years are, especially if you're new to the social space, I think there's a lot of time that you spend trying to understand what's happening there and what really works for the communities. So if you look at our journey in the last 7 years, I would really call it an experimentation. And at least now we have a good handle of our operations. We know what makes the right partner, what does it take to actually evaluate them, what are the risk mitigation strategies. So without having answers to all of this, it would have been quite foolish for us to think of scaling at that point. And then as first-time entrepreneurs, there are also a set of organizational challenges that you face. So you're dabbling with challenges at the community level, you're also dabbling with challenges at the organizational level, and you need to strike a good balance between the two in order to really think of scaling. So I think I'm confident now that the next few years we'll be looking at scaling, because we have found answers to a few questions that we were really dabbling with.
So I think the question I had was, Selco is looking at, does social franchising. So for Head Held High, is there any such way that you're looking at to kind of, replicate what you're doing? Because, right now you're trying to train villagers to become more confident and become a part of the skilled workforce. So are you looking at not just partnership, but training other organizations to be able to do that?
Yeah, so yesterday I was trying to talk to the guys in NIT, use their capabilities to, extend ourselves into villages or get them into villages. I also met some ministers to try and do it with the government. It's a natural, next natural step. What I think, what you said was very valuable, which is that the first 7 years, which is, we are also about 7 years old, coincidentally. So I also, when I look back, I think this has been a learning journey. I think we've pretty much now have a decent handle, reasonably decent handle. But if we don't look at scale, then we may as well not set up shop. And scale in this world isn't the same. So I also run a business, not the size of Sumir's business, but very small one. But there it doesn't matter. You could set up a restaurant chain. My daughter runs a cafe. She may want to have 2 more cafes, and she's very happy. And I would say, don't go mad trying to make McDonald's. But in this world, if the reason that we are doing it is to make a massive difference, because we have 400 million people who are very poor. The world has 2 billion people who are very poor. So this is a huge, huge journey. So there's no point in doing it unless you're going to do scale. And in this world, scale means you have to be here at least for 20 years. So you've got to be clear that you're not going to get anywhere for the first 5 years. If you are fine with that, and you have that sense of commitment, build it. You'll make it. You'll do great.
So what are the various ways in which you're
various ways.
Yeah.
I'm sorry. So for us, logically, there are only 2 ways. We can't grow ourselves. For instance, we want to do 2 million as the first goal that we have is 2 million by 2022. So if you do the maths, I would need to employ over 100,000 trainers to do that. If I charge that money and I recover that money, I would be bigger than Reliance. It's a huge number. So therefore, it obviously can't be done by us. What we had to do is perfect the model, which we've done. We've got 22 centers today. We've recognized how to have a cluster of centers. What didn't work there, we're relearning it again. And now we know that we can go to, say, the government of India and say, Mr. well, I forgot his name. I read it yesterday as well. Where the gentleman is in charge of skills, that look, we have the magic, I don't know how we got it, but we got it. You have the ability to reach out to the country. Say NIT, an organization has the capability to do this in a logistically great way. Can we form a partnership to do it? To me, that's the logical step. The other alternative is, and this is what I told the heads of NIT yesterday, that look, if you don't want to do it, it's not the most difficult thing to set up logistics, but it's still in the government of India. Now the government of India also says no, then we'll have to set up something like a McDonald's franchisee kind of model and see if that's working. The point is you will never stop. That's the bottom line. Because there are no predictable answers in this world, our world. Even United has been experimenting for the last 7, 8, 10 years, trying to figure out what's the best way. So they set up 5 organizations trying to do different things. So persistence, to my mind, is the key.
So Abhijit, I had a question for you in terms of what do you look at in terms of social enterprise when you're looking at funding them and getting investors to them? What sort of scale do you look at, or do you really look at that as the primary criteria to be able to actually fund them?
So I'll take a bit of liberty before answering that. Actually, very interesting point on scale. And see, one of the things which has come up is social entrepreneurship has become style statement. So one has to look at if you look at today, a lot of people are coming up, but certain things I would like to bring to the platform are all learned from very seniors, like you see people around who have done it in the last few years. So one day Ramesh Ramath was speaking at a play, in one of our events, and he said, see, we are cut out for this job. We have decided to go and do this. It's not easy, a lot of pains. So first of all, be very clear what you are going to do, because once you are there, it's a one-way traffic. You can't come back. Because if you are committing yourself, it's a very long-term commitment. It cannot be a fun to do 2 years and leave it at that, because you are trying to do a business which is making impact. That's most important. Second is, not everything, you may see a lot of demand for services, multiple services, but very clear in your mind that not everything has to be done by the private sector. There are things which government has to do, there are things which other has to do. Okay? So figure out what you think you can do, and do it efficiently over a longer period of time. 3 is, it's easy to say scale. You are trying to build a scale, but the best way to do that is from day one build systems and processes. It's not about just the technology. Yes, technology is critical, but system and process, because once you go into a game of scale, once you keep the ball rolling, it's like, it's a railway line. Once you build a railway line, trains can take multiple routes and all. Once they go on in that route, you can control a bit of speed, but you can't stop them from operating. So underneath your process, the signaling system, the driver, the cleaners, everything is not in order or not well defined. There will be a lot of challenges. So building a well-greased, in a sense, not a negative balance, and a well-done system is very important from day one. So whether it is a technological, whether it's a process, whatever you are, you should keep in mind. Coming to the point of your question, what we look at, and actually this is one of our jobs, we look at helping companies scale and raise capital for them. So in the process, we have a lot of learnings actually out of the different countries. Even looked at Grameen Bank very extensively. There are a lot of good things, there are a lot of bad things, which ultimately helps us to guide others. So we looked at multiple businesses in different domains, whether it is healthcare. Even today we talk about affordable healthcare. But we need to understand how the healthcare system works, and then look at what the efficiencies can be built in. So we try to see that is the promoter or the entrepreneur or a group of promoters and entrepreneurs trying to really look at where are the gaps and trying to build efficiency on the gaps to provide an affordable service, provide an affordable treatment protocol, provide affordable diagnostics, provide affordable, in case of education, a pedagogy, delivering system, whether it is technology based, non-technology based. So and guide them accordingly. So I think one of the criteria or one of the things we do in the beginning itself is when you start talking to see that, can we help apart from the capital raise? What else? Can we take them to the market? Like in one of the company, I'm not even raising capital, but just taking to the market. Like they're based out of Bangalore, doing amazing work, but ultimately the revenues are not great, around a couple of crores. But the potential is so much. It's the only question of connecting. He's an innovator. He can innovate. You tell him anything like I need a modification here in this machine. In just couple of hours, the design is ready. He's so passionate about it. How can we take him to the next level? So it's about connecting to the market because he's not a marketing guy. So I think there are a lot of inputs like this which we help. So I think for us, it's to understand that this entrepreneur had the passion to build a business. Maybe he needs some input, and we are here to help him on the capital and a few other inputs from the market side.
Can we hear from you?
So, unfortunately, I'm not able to throw much light on scale because in the last 1 year, I've got rather conflicted on scale. As part of helping put together GAP, I got to meet several people who've done a lot and who thought very deeply on the subject of scale and effectiveness. So they've transferred some of that dilemma onto me. So my earlier way of thinking was I'd seen very powerful examples of national change caused by very few people through activism. I wasn't a part of that process, but I got to witness it. For example, the whole creation of the Right to Information Act, which today has been applied in so many ways all across the country in so many areas, to much good quite often. And that was a work of a handful of activists actually originally who had this thought 20 years ago in a small village in Rajasthan and who recognized its power within a panchayat and then kept driving that idea until it reached into national legislation. Or the idea of the school meal. Again, there's a small set of activists centered around the PUCL who filed a famous case in the Supreme Court which says that the right to life in our constitution must mean a school meal in a context when government has overflowing go-downs and rats eating it, and we have so many malnourished children in our country. And they got the court over 5 years not only to agree to that interpretation of the right to life. The Supreme Court chased 15 states' chief secretaries month after month, till after 5 years we have 100 million hot meals served every day to children across the school, raising school enrollment, breaking caste barriers, improving educational attainment, perhaps, right? So I'd seen, or the Pulse Polio program, which all of us know, right, has worked so well, and that's a partnership between the Government of India, UN bodies, the Rotary, etc., etc. So there are clearly ways of some things causing large amount of changes to the benefit of many people, right? And also from the world of business, I've seen supply chains which can deliver across. So the person I was speaking to as part of GAP was saying, look, those things work, those are either instruments, for example, right to information is an instrument, or Pulse Polio relies on the constancy of our bodies. All human beings, a large set of human beings will react predictably to the polio vaccine, where solutions are standardized, right? And you can then scale them because you're pretty much doing the same thing, but doing it over much larger areas or with many more people. So that makes sense. But he says when you look at poverty, poverty is defined in your local context. Each poor family is poor in a different way. It is the circumstances of that family that you need to see, or that village or that locality which you need to see. And what is it that is the obstruction to change or to well-being in that specific circumstance? So you need to identify what are those dominant forces there and what are the missing capabilities. And that will change every few miles you drive. So he put forward the idea that, look, there is no large-scale eradication of poverty possible. You can have large-scale tools, but if you want to actually change a person's life or a household's life, it has to be localized, and those localized solutions are different, and there is no national organization which can address poverty. There's an only national organization which is possible is one which does different things in different places. So that got me thinking, because there are very few organizations in the world, whether you're Coca-Cola or the World Health Organization, you don't actually do different things in different places, or even the Catholic Church or any large global organization. There's great variation, but you're trying to do the same thing everywhere you go. And so that's food for thought. I'm sorry I'm not helping build the key determinants of what causes scale. But at our two-day event, we will be trying to do that, to understand the landscape and the forces and the actors and how they change. So I've just shared my dilemma with you all. Thank you.
Sure. Thanks. So I think that was an interesting point that he left us with in terms of whether we are actually also able to scale the outcome, because you're really customizing to each person's needs. So it's probably not very standardized. So I think we'll open the forum to questions from the audience, and then we can take it from there.
Actually, I have a question for Sunil. You mentioned that in your video, somebody mentioned that he's working as a team leader and he got the training for like 8 months. So did the person undertake any other course, or was the 8 months course in English sufficient enough for the person to take up a BPO job?
I think it's working now. So now the training, by the way, is in 6 months. It's called, when we call it transformation, because it's not really training. It's also not just English, it's capability building. So he becomes capable and he knows that he is capable. That really is our definition of, being, that's what we do. The 6-month training the training that he got was make him capable to do BPO work, standard BPO work. And all the training that we do, the person when he comes out would be as good as somebody who can do a BPO starting point. Now, if you're looking at a BPO enterprise or any enterprise, which is domain knowledge, for instance, if he goes to a hospital, for instance, one of our chaps works in Narayana Rudralaya, and he must have learned that on the job. But if we are also preparing people for a company which wants to take on about 1,000 people, we'll train those people. The last 2 weeks or the last 1 month will be in accordance to the skill sets needed by that individual organization for that individual job. So we'll sort of fashion it around that. And that's not too difficult to do. The more difficult thing is to have a common element, which is like what we have in English in a normal world, is graduation.
Sure. No, 8 months graduation is very good, actually. 6 months, yeah.
Well, I must tell you what happened. I love telling stories. So we met Mr. Tata recently again through the Tata Trust, and there was a gentleman called Mr. Soonawala. He's an old Parsi gentleman, very nice man, extraordinary man. He's on every board of the Tata companies, and he's must be about 78 years old. I don't know how. I wouldn't ask him. So he, once I didn't have our colleague come, one villager, but in that meeting we had a villager who came and spoke instead of me, because that's really the more important thing. So Mr. Soonawala said, "Arey Baba, what have you done? 15 years of education you have put into 6 months. What will we do with the schools?" And I love that statement. In my mind, that is great.
I think that should happen to most of the private colleges, engineering colleges in India, because what happens to kids after going through those 4 years, I'm seeing, is the skills are degraded. They would have been better off probably if I hire them after 12th.
Yeah, hello. Actually, I had a very basic question. Many of us are at many points in our life, we want to start on something. It could be a project, it could be a small enterprise, it could be a social work initiative. And then, the ideas come, it comes and it stays with you for a week or two, and you do something little, and then you get busy with your own lives. And the point which, keeps pulling, one person like me down is, like, you're never sure whether I'm actually ready to take the jump. What are the main basic things I should be sure of before really committing for longer period?
in our case, I think being prepared to fail was our biggest strength. So when we started, we had nothing. We said we're going to give it our everything if this is supposed to work, and if it's an idea that time has come, then it will really work. Or we had plan B, plan C, plan D, everything ready, just because psychologically it meant great to have those plan Bs and plan Cs. But then in our minds we knew if this is not going to work, nothing's going wrong. We are still going back to our life and everything will continue as it is. And I think that was our biggest security. That, and the second thing, when we decided to put in our own money and not go after funds or seek funding at the initial stage, because what we realized earlier on is ideas never get funded. You need to make sure that, you need to bring it to a stage where people are able to see it, it's a working prototype, only then it gets funded. I think these two decisions that we took was really, really helpful for us.
I think I'd like to respond to that as well. It's a dilemma I think most of the entrepreneurs face, but I think first of all you have to, come out of the comfort zone. You have to take that call that will you be in a comfortable position having a job, whatever you're doing, or you are trying to do something different. That's what makes the entrepreneurs, right? Because many of them leave their very early stage. I mean, kids out of college do entrepreneurship, and they know that they may not earn in the next 2-3 years. They would like to take that struggle, but there is a different passion there. So I think always there is a fear to fail, no doubt about it, but I think the willpower, the thing that I am not in a comfort zone, I have to struggle hard, and that's how I think people become successful. I mean, they came and they had all the plans, but many of them don't have a second plan also, very clearly. And when we started also in the first year, I mean, we started in 2008, July, the first day of operation, and 2008, the financial crisis, and we are in the financial markets. Tough, no business. Again, we picked up the business, 2010, the microfinance crisis hit. Again, the business is gone. But I think obviously we had, by the time got good investors to support us. But then the fear that we lose our business would something, if you carry with you, it would be difficult. I think you have to come out of the comfort zone, think that this is what you're passionate about. Maybe you have to do much more learning, that's a different thing. But you have to be passionate about it, go whole hog. After that, certain things you have to leave to different chances. But I think if you have the passion to do it, you will succeed.
So when we started this, first of all, I didn't have any money. I sent out an email to 50 people and said I need to raise 10 lakhs because I want to do an experiment. Within 24 hours, I had the money and the computers. I had good friends, obviously. One of them is sitting there. So, but the other thing is that I have still not come out of my normal job. Though my other colleagues have, we have 120 people working with us, and people who are rest of the organization is permanent. Sumir and I are not. We still do our day jobs. So what that means is you could perhaps do a day job and yet do this if you are able to do that. If you have that ability, or you have enough play with your time. I run the company, so I have play with my time. That's the first thing. This is the second thing. The third thing I want to just share with you is when we met Mohammed Yunus, every time he would tell me a story about somebody he has, one story like a Ramesh story. He would tell me, that 10 days back in the social innovation thing, there's this boy who stood up and he gave me, this is what he said, this is what happened, and we gave 10,000 taka or whatever. To him, it is all about that one person. The moment you become, the trouble with scale is you'll think in numbers, and you have to. But you will lose your sense of passion. So you have to balance the two. All the greats that you've seen here, which we're going to be showcasing in GAP, Bankar Roy, Aruna, all of them are very deeply committed to the individual. That makes a difference. If you are committed to that individual, if you know a Ramesh or somebody who you care deeply about, you will stay the long while. So test that for yourself.
So I have a question to the two gentlemen from Head Held High. So first of all, I'm a great admirer of your work, but I also feel that, as I understand it, you mostly focus on BPO kind of jobs, right? So I was wondering that there is an experiment which Ho and Sridhar Vembu are doing in Chennai. So I was wondering, are we kind of underestimating potential? If we can tap them at earlier age, say 11th grade, then we can actually inculcate that love for science and math and maybe, because, I mean, BPO job is better than being unemployed, but why kind of, we should reach out for something higher, which is like an actual product job where they, contribute much more value.
So we started out as Abhijit mentioned, your organization will morph. So when we started out, we had this great dream that we'll have 500, 500,000 people doing BPO work because we knew all the heads of the BPO companies, IBM, every single guy. They sat in my house and they said, yes, we will do this together, and nothing happened. In the end of the day, it didn't take off the way it did. Ashok Giri, in fact, was part of it in the initial stages. And he did very well. He had the commitment to do it. And other friends of ours have got 2,000-seater BPOs. But we realized very soon that we can't scale it to 2 million people. It's stupid. What we wanted to do was get them out of poverty. We didn't care what that out of poverty meant. Now what we realize is, if we get them a job, no matter what we do, we are taking a job from Mysore into the village, or we're taking a Bangalore or a New York job into the village. We're not creating value in the world. So now our focus has become entrepreneurship. So right now we have morphed into creating huge amounts of entrepreneurship. So ideally, we would like every person who gets transformed to go and start becoming a job creator rather than a job seeker. And we think that's going to be the big shift in what we do. So to answer your question, BPO is in fact over right now for us. We have a BPO, but that's a small part of what we do. We do last mile services. We do all kinds of things. We do surveys in the villages. We're trying to be the bridge between the urban world and the rural world over the next 10 years. That's the company's vision which we have.
Hello ma'am, Preeti ma'am, this question is for you. This is regarding, you have told regarding the Rangde's funding entrepreneurs regarding in the field of microfinance, basically the form of microfinance activity you are engaged in. What I want to ask is, how do you ensure such a low rate of default? That's number one. And why you are not plowing back your profits instead of asking for more capital?
Okay, so I'll answer the second one first, because we are not yet a profitable organization. So the vision is that at whatever point we become sustainable, and any surpluses that the organization makes will go back into the organization, because we believe it's important to have a very strong organizational base. The first question about default rates is, the way we work is we work with community-based organizations across different parts of the country. The community-based organization is our partner, and we reach out to communities through them. And there are two things the community-based organizations do. One is to see that the individuals who are selected for loans have the ability to repay the loans. Second, they're also members of groups, usually a self-help group or a cooperative in our case. So what it does is it ensures that because of the social guarantee that is there, if one person is not able to repay, the other members actually pitch in. And that acts as peer pressure within the group. And historically, that's been the model that the microfinance world has adopted. And we have tried to adopt it as much as possible, but at the same time, there are variations based on who our communities are. So in Karnataka, we would work with cooperatives, and in Maharashtra, for example, we work with self-help groups. So that really ensures that, they're repaying. And the second thing is the loan amounts that we give are really based on their ability to repay. So if so we start off, say, with an 8,000 or a 10,000 rupee loan, they are eligible to get a next loan only after they've repaid their first loan in completion. So there's some sort of a method to the way people have been screened and identified on the ground and the way the loans are disbursed.
Once again, see, the main failure for microfinance in this country, though the model is very good, is that the people who are the borrowers, they access multiple microfinance institutions and get repeated lending, and finally the load becomes too high for them. So that is one of the main reason while the suicides also taken place and you know what has happened.
Yeah,
so
so
how
that's
do you really, as it is justify model, how do you attack that?
So I think a lot has happened after the microfinance crisis, happened in 2010, and all this actually came to light. But if you look at what we did when we started in 2008, since then the focus has been on reaching out to communities that don't have access to formal financial institutions or even microfinance. So the kind of groups that we work with are those that don't even have access to microfinance and they're first-time borrowers. So in some sense, that prevents, the occurrence of multiple lending. For example, if you look at the work that we do in Karnataka with a group called Charaka, they're a cooperative, and no microfinance would ever actually fund them because of the kind of model they are, and our funding has actually helped them ease out their working capital issues. So the focus is on developing projects and credit-based programs where microfinance has also failed to deliver. So that's how we've been able to stay away from all the multiple lending issues that we have faced in the industry.
I think one of the points is what you said is why failed. I mean, I don't know whether I should say why failed completely, but there are some challenges in some areas. But today, if you look at it, regulation has brought things on a platform where a borrower cannot take more than 2 loans. The total indebtedness cannot be more than 50,000. So all those things have been built in now after all the learnings, as you were saying, a lot of learnings. But I think why, historically also, if you look at it, why it has been low, there are valid reasons for that. Not that every MFI follows the same system and procedure, but if you look at in a group, what happens if it is not individual loans? The loans may be given to individuals, but it is through a group mechanism. So what happens is there are self-selection that happens. Like say, I know Smita or I know him. So if I know that I may be the first member, then if I have to choose for the second member, I'll try to see who are good people around that. So the self-selection actually reduces the risk of default in future. And 2 is the group guarantee, because they are also, as a group, we are all liable. If I default, she is liable. She has to put in money. He is also liable. So all these things make it up for a better selection of clients. And then top of that, as he said, many of the places you don't have an option to take a loan. Even money lenders don't give a loan. If the money lender gives also, it's so high that they can't afford. So the ease of access, and the last but not the least, the most important point, what we felt in microfinance, which really worked for the higher repayment rate, is the flexibility of reaching to the villages by the MFIs. Now think of it, if they were asked to come to the bank, sit for 3 hours to do 1 deposit, the travel time and everything included. So they will not come because many of them are daily wage earners. Many of them can only work during the day. They can't work in the night because electricity and other problems. So somebody is going and doing a doorstep delivery, which is very critical. And not only that, added on to that is the cash flow issue, where many of them are daily wage earners. Many of them are shop wherein the cash flows are daily basis. So microfinance initially built a weekly model. Even many of them did a daily model. So weekly means the amount of EMI and all, EMI, the size of the EMI, the regulatory and the touch points, because every week people going, every fortnight people are going to meet them. So the touch points are very important. I think that is probably one of the main reasons why microfinance repayment rates have been low.
Rudresh here.
You'll take this will be the last.
Sorry, the default rates are low.
Rudresh here. This is with respect to Rangde. If I lend some $100 to a borrower of yours, so will the entire amount goes to the borrower, or just Rangde acts as a platform in that, or you deduct some money from my $100 and you lend the leftover money to him?
The entire 100 rupees actually goes to the borrower.
Okay.
Because we get a cut out of the interest that the borrower pays. So it typically for a livelihood loan, it would be around 8.5% flat per annum.
Okay.
That's what the borrower pays.
Okay.
Out of that, Rangde gets 2%. So
Okay.
your 100 rupees goes there, but when the borrower pays 100 plus 8.5, we get 2% out of that.
So you meant to say that the APR which you are talking about is somewhere around 9 to 18%.
Yes.
So you will take out the $2 from it. So
Yeah.
so effectively he'll be paying 20% or he'll be paying 18%?
No, okay, so I use flat rates because most people are comfortable listening to flat rates. So our loans are 8.5%, which is 15.3% on an APR basis.
Okay. Thank you.
So thanks everyone. I think it was a very interactive session. So we'll close track 2 now and we'll regroup after lunch for track 3.
Hello.
Thank you.
Ask the last question. Sorry. So the hi, I'm Preeti.
So if anybody wants to interact with the speakers, you can interact outside. Sorry. One moment, we'll just hand over the mementos to the speakers. Okay. Yeah. So the lunch break will be for about 30 to 40 minutes, and the lunch is being served on the right side. And the next 2 tracks, one will be on corporate social responsibility. And the third one?
New enterprise.